Before the shadows of pain began to cloud her life, Margaret lived in a world full of light. She had always believed in the power of love and thought that, like everyone else, she would find a partner who would cherish and care for her forever. Growing up in a small, close-knit town, Margaret's childhood had been filled with love, laughter, and the warmth of family. Her parents, though not wealthy, had given her everything she could ever ask for: their support, guidance, and unconditional love. When she met Ryan, she thought she had finally found someone who would add to the happiness she had grown up with. He was everything she had imagined her perfect partner to be: handsome, well-spoken, and kind. From the first moment they met at a mutual friend's party, Ryan's smile seemed to light up the room. He was attentive, always remembering the little details about her: her favorite books, the songs that made her smile, even her childhood dreams. He spoke with a tenderness that made her feel like she was the only one in the world. The charm he exuded was undeniable, and Margaret felt herself falling for him more with every passing day. Ryan's love seemed like a dream come true. He would bring her flowers, write sweet notes, and spend hours talking about their future together. The love they shared felt pure, untainted by the struggles that often came with relationships. Friends and family watched in awe as the two of them grew closer, and soon, Margaret felt a deep sense of security with him. They were a perfect couple in the eyes of everyone around them. Her mother adored him, her father welcomed him like a son, and her friends envied the bond they had. Ryan promised her that he would always be there, that nothing would ever come between them. 2 years later, Ryan proposed to Margaret in the most romantic way possible. He took her to the same spot where they had their first date, under the twinkling lights of a cozy, intimate restaurant. With a tear in his eye and a tremble in his voice, he asked her to be his wife. Overwhelmed with joy, she said yes without hesitation. It felt like the perfect ending to a beautiful story, and Margaret couldn't imagine anything but bliss ahead. Their wedding day was everything she had ever dreamed of. The ceremony was held in a church filled with friends, family, and an abundance of flowers. Ryan stood by her side, looking every bit the dashing groom as he gazed at her with love in his eyes. She walked down the aisle in her white gown, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. They exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through thick and thin. Margaret couldn't have been happier. She believed, as many do on their wedding day, that this was the beginning of a life full of endless love and happiness. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Everything was perfect. Her family approved of Ryan, and her friends whispered that she had found the man of her dreams. They were a team, inseparable, destined to share a life filled with joy. But little did Margaret know, this was just the beginning. The man she had married was not who he appeared to be. The happiness she felt in those early days would soon be replaced by something far darker. But for now, she was living in a dream, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to tear apart the life she thought she had. The early days of their marriage were nothing short of magical. Ryan and Margaret had settled into a comfortable routine, the kind that most newlyweds dream of. They had a small apartment, cozy and just right for the two of them. Every day seemed like a new chapter in their fairy tale, a story filled with love, laughter, and shared moments. But beneath the surface, a subtle shift was beginning to take place. It was a Tuesday evening when it happened, the first time Margaret saw the cracks in Ryan's perfect facade. She had spent the afternoon preparing his favorite meal: chicken parmesan with a side of garlic bread and a fresh salad. She was proud of the meal, excited to surprise him after a long day at work. But in her rush, she made a small mistake. The chicken was slightly overcooked. It wasn't burnt, just a little drier than usual. Still, she hoped Ryan wouldn't mind. After all, it was just dinner. Ryan came home, his face lighting up as he kissed her cheek. "What smells so good?" he asked, his voice warm and familiar. He was the same Ryan she had married, charming and loving. But when he sat down at the table, the smile that had greeted her slowly began to fade. Margaret watched, almost in slow motion, as he took a bite of the chicken. His eyes narrowed, and his face twisted with something she couldn't quite place. Disappointment? Anger? She couldn't tell. What is this? Ryan's voice was colder than she had ever heard it. Margaret's heart sank. It's your favorite, chicken parmesan, she replied, trying to brush off the tension in the air. He looked down at the plate, pushing the chicken aside with a visible disgust. It's ruined. You can't even cook a simple meal right. What kind of wife are you? His words stung, sharper than she could have anticipated. Margaret froze, unsure of how to react. She hadn't expected this. This was supposed to be a simple, loving dinner, nothing more. She laughed nervously, trying to ease the tension. Oh, come on, it's not that bad. It's just a little overdone. I can make something else if you want, she offered weakly, her voice trembling. Ryan didn't laugh. Instead, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His eyes darkened as he took a step toward her, towering over her seated form. I told you it's not good enough. You should have gotten it right. You don't care about me at all, do you? His voice had dropped to a low growl, and for the first time since they met, Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Before she could react, the slap came. It was quick, so fast she barely saw it coming. Ryan's hand connected with her cheek, the force knocking her head back. The sound of it, the sharp crack of his palm against her skin, seemed to echo in the room, reverberating in her mind long after it had happened. Margaret stood there in shock, her hand pressed to her reddened cheek, unable to process what had just transpired. Ryan's anger was like a wave crashing into her, leaving her gasping for air. He stood there, watching her, his breath heavy. Then, in an instant, the storm passed. His eyes softened, and the hardness in his features melted away as quickly as it had come. He stepped forward, taking her hands in his. I'm so sorry, Margaret, he said, his voice now shaky, full of remorse. I don't know what came over me. I've been so stressed out with work, and I snapped. I never meant to hurt you. Please forgive me. I love you. I would never hurt you. Margaret stood there, still reeling from the shock, her cheek burning. She wanted to scream, to ask him what had just happened, but the words caught in her throat. He was apologizing, promising it would never happen again. It was just a mistake, wasn't it? Just a moment of weakness. After all, who didn't lose their temper every once in a while? He was stressed, and maybe she had pushed him too hard with the dinner. It wasn't a big deal, was it? Ryan pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly, almost desperately. It's all been too much. I love you so much. Please don't leave me. Margaret stood there, frozen in his arms, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions crashing over her. She could feel the sincerity in his touch, the way he held her, but something inside her was stirring, a nagging voice telling her that this wasn't right. Yet, as she pulled away and looked into his eyes, she saw the same man she had married, the man who had promised to always love her, to take care of her. It was just a moment, she told herself. A mistake. He was sorry. It would never happen again. And so she excused it. She made excuses for him, for his anger, for the slap. Maybe it was her fault for not getting the chicken right, or maybe he was just under too much stress. They all had their breaking points, didn't they? Maybe this was his. The next day, Ryan came home with flowers and an apology, and the cycle began to repeat. He was sweet again, buying her gifts, saying the right things, showing love as though nothing had happened. She smiled, reassured by the gifts, the attention. He wasn't angry anymore, and for now, she had no reason to doubt him. He promised it would never happen again. So she believed him. It was easier to believe him than to confront the possibility that the man she loved was capable of such cruelty. But deep down, a small part of her wondered, what if this was just the beginning? As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the love that once seemed so perfect began to unravel. Margaret had hoped that the first incident would be a one-time occurrence, a lapse in judgment. But as time passed, it became clear that it was not. Each day felt like she was walking on eggshells, trying to avoid setting off the storm that she had come to fear. Ryan's temper, once hidden behind charming smiles and sweet gestures, started to show itself more frequently. What had started as a small mistake, burnt chicken, quickly spiraled into more explosive outbursts over insignificant things. It could be a missed phone call, a small disagreement about household chores, or even a change in the weather. Nothing was ever good enough, and no matter how hard Margaret tried to make everything perfect, it never was. The second time it happened, Margaret had made sure to cook dinner early, hoping to avoid the chaos that had ensued last time. She prepared his favorite meal again, but this time, she made sure everything was just right. But when Ryan came home, he seemed to be in a foul mood from the moment he walked through the door. His eyes were cold, his shoulders stiff. She knew something was off, but she couldn't pinpoint it. She greeted him with a smile, trying to lighten the mood. But it was like he didn't even see her. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath as he sat at the table. Margaret's heart sank, and she watched as he picked up his fork and poked at the food she had so carefully prepared. "This is pathetic," he snapped. "I work all day and come home to this?" I'm sorry," Margaret stammered, her hands trembling as she stood by the stove. "I thought you'd like it." He didn't respond. Instead, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Margaret barely had time to react before he grabbed her by the arm and shoved her against the wall. The air left her lungs, and her head hit the hard surface with a sickening thud. She gasped in pain, her heart pounding as she struggled to steady herself. Ryan's grip tightened, his fingers digging into her arm as he leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "Don't ever disrespect me like that again. You understand me?" His voice was low, dangerous, and for the first time, Margaret saw something in his eyes that terrified her, a look of pure rage. The shock of it all left her frozen. She didn't know what to say, what to do. She had never seen this side of Ryan before, and she didn't know how to react. She wanted to run, to scream, to fight back, but something kept her rooted in place. The fear, the confusion, it all swirled together in a haze that left her paralyzed. After a moment, Ryan released her and turned away, his back to her. Margaret stumbled back, her legs shaky, her heart racing in her chest. She could still feel the imprint of his fingers on her arm, the heat of his anger still lingering in the air. But just as quickly as the storm had come, it began to pass. Ryan let out a long, weary sigh, running a hand through his hair as he turned back toward her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice now softer, almost pleading. "I don't know what came over me. I've just been so stressed with work. You know I didn't mean it, right? I love you, I do." Margaret stared at him, her mind a blur of conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe him, to believe that it was just a moment of weakness. He seemed so sorry, so full of remorse. He had apologized. He had begged her forgiveness. And the next day he brought home roses, a diamond bracelet, and took her out to dinner. He was sweet again, loving, and affectionate, just as he had been before. He made promises that it would never happen again. He was so convincing, so genuine in his apologies, that Margaret found herself believing him. She told herself that it was a one-time thing, that everyone makes mistakes, that she had to forgive him for the sake of their marriage. But deep down, a small voice inside her began to whisper, what if this wasn't just a mistake? What if it was something more? The nagging doubt didn't go away. It followed her, lurking in the back of her mind, but she pushed it aside. She didn't want to believe that the man she loved was capable of hurting her. She didn't want to admit that the man who had once seemed so perfect could be a monster. And so the cycle continued. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern became undeniable. Ryan's temper flared up over the smallest things, another burnt meal, a disagreement about household chores, even a change in plans. Each time, the abuse escalated a little more. The slaps, the pushing, the verbal insults. Every time, Margaret would try to apologize to make things right. And every time, Ryan would promise that it would never happen again. But with each promise came another incident, another violent outburst. Margaret found herself walking on eggshells, terrified to make a mistake, terrified to provoke him. She would try so hard to be perfect, to keep him happy, but it was never enough. She was never enough. It was during one of these episodes when Ryan slammed his fist into the wall, his anger radiating like heat, that the first real thought of leaving crossed her mind. But even as the thought entered her head, it was quickly followed by a wave of self-doubt and fear. Where would she go? What would she do? She didn't have the strength to leave. She couldn't imagine life without him, even though it was clear that he was destroying her. The thought of escaping was terrifying, and as much as she wanted to leave, something inside her held her back. The fear of what he might do if she tried. And so, the cycle continued. Abuse, apology, love, anger, abuse again. Margaret felt trapped, unable to escape, unable to break free. The man she had married had become a stranger, a man she didn't recognize. Yet she kept telling herself it was her fault. She was the one who made mistakes. She was the one who pushed him to the edge. She had to be the one to fix it. She had to make things right. But deep down, a small part of her knew the cycle would never end until she found the strength to leave. Margaret's life, once filled with light and love, slowly began to fade into a shadow she didn't recognize. Each day felt like she was sinking deeper, her world growing smaller and more confined. The small cracks that had appeared early in the marriage had widened, and now they were gaping holes, swallowing her up. Ryan's abuse wasn't just physical, it had wormed its way into her soul, cutting off the parts of herself that made her feel whole. The first signs of isolation were subtle. At first, it was just little things, Ryan suggesting she didn't need to go out with her friends. "We haven't had a quiet night in a while. Why don't you stay in tonight?" he'd say with a smile that was warm enough to make her question her own desire to leave the house. But it was always the same story. A polite request turned into a demand. "Do you really need to go out with them again?" Ryan would ask, his voice laced with a quiet edge that made her hesitate. "You know how I feel when you spend more time with them than me." Margaret tried to brush it off, telling herself that maybe he was just lonely. After all, they had been married for almost a year now. But as the weeks went by, Ryan's control over her social life tightened. He became less subtle in his requests. The phone calls from her best friend, Janice, went unanswered. Her mother's voice on the other end of the line started to sound distant, hurt. "Margaret, why do you keep canceling our plans?" she'd ask, and Margaret would make up an excuse. Anything to avoid telling her the truth. That Ryan didn't want her to go. That she had no control anymore over even the simplest of choices. One evening, after Margaret had insisted she was just too tired to go out, Ryan smiled at her. "I'm glad you stayed home," he said, his voice soft, but with an undercurrent of something darker. "You know, you're always better off with me. Anyway, I don't want you hanging around those people who don't understand you like I do." Margaret's heart sank. She had always been close to her friends and family, but now every time she spoke to them, she felt as if Ryan was watching her, listening, judging. The isolation became suffocating. Margaret's world shrank to the four walls of their apartment, where she spent most of her days cleaning, cooking, and trying to keep Ryan happy. It wasn't long before the bruises started to show. At first, they were small, finger marks on her arms, or a faint bruise on her thigh from when Ryan had shoved her into a wall. But the hits got harder, the anger more frequent. He would find any excuse to lash out, whether it was something she said, something she didn't do, or sometimes nothing at all. Each time, Ryan would apologize, profusely, offering her gifts or taking her out to dinner. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. I don't know what's wrong with me," he would say, his eyes pleading with her. And Margaret, worn down by the constant cycle of abuse, would forgive him. How could she not? The man who had once promised to love her unconditionally was now a stranger who was hurting her. but he always made it seem like it was her fault. The bruises became more frequent, the cuts more visible. Margaret would cover them with makeup and long sleeves, trying to hide the evidence of her pain from the world. She became an expert at pretending everything was fine. No one noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the hollow look in her face. At work, her colleagues commented on how tired she seemed, but Margaret would just smile, brushing it off as stress. She was losing herself, fading into the background of her own life, becoming nothing more than a shadow of who she once was. At night, when Ryan was asleep, Margaret would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body aching from the day's physical toll. The fear, the guilt, the shame, all of it weighed heavily on her. She couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried. The more she tried to be perfect, the more she failed. Nothing she did seemed to make Ryan happy for long. There was always something wrong, something she had overlooked, something she had said or done that triggered his anger. It was never enough. And then the self-blame started. Margaret began to believe that maybe it was her fault. Maybe she wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe if she were a better wife, a better cook, a better listener, Ryan wouldn't be like this. Maybe if she didn't laugh too loudly, or say the wrong thing, or accidentally spill the milk, everything would be okay. She started to rationalize the abuse, convincing herself that she deserved it. That if she could just change, just be better, Ryan wouldn't have to get so angry. If she could just be perfect, everything would be fine. But deep down, Margaret knew that wasn't true. She knew that this wasn't normal, that no one deserved to be treated like this. But she didn't have the strength to leave. Fear paralyzed her. What would she do without him? Where would she go? She had no savings, no job of her own. She was isolated, dependent on him for everything. The thought of leaving was terrifying. She had no control over her life anymore. And so she stayed. She stayed because she believed that if she just endured, if she just took it, maybe it would stop. Maybe Ryan would see how much she loved him, how much she needed him, and everything would go back to normal. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. There was no going back to the way things were. Margaret was losing herself piece by piece, and she didn't know how to stop it. It was a Thursday evening when everything changed. The moment that would mark the tipping point in Margaret's marriage, the moment she could no longer pretend, no longer ignore the truth of her situation. The tension between her and Ryan had been building for weeks. Small arguments had become regular occurrences, each one more vicious than the last. The smallest things set him off, missing a spot when cleaning, forgetting to buy his favorite cereal, or simply making the wrong comment at the wrong time. But that night, it wasn't a mistake or an oversight that sparked the eruption. It was a question, a simple question that Margaret had been afraid to ask for months. Ryan, what's going on? Why are you so angry all the time? She didn't even realize how much she had been holding her breath until the words left her mouth. As soon as she said it, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Ryan's eyes, usually filled with charm and affection, suddenly darkened. He had been pacing in the kitchen, his back to her as he fiddled with the dishes. But when he heard the question, he stopped dead in his tracks. Margaret could feel the shift in the room, the coldness creeping in. Why do you always have to ask so many questions? Ryan snapped, his voice sharp. What do you think I'm doing? Huh? I'm working my ass off to provide for you, and all you do is sit here complaining. Margaret recoiled, feeling the familiar sting of his words. I'm not complaining, Ryan. You're always looking for something wrong, always finding fault with everything I do. His voice grew louder, sharper, like nails on a chalkboard. Maybe if you stopped criticizing me for once, I wouldn't be so angry. Before she could respond, before she could even take a breath, Ryan spun around and stormed toward her. Margaret's heart began to race. She had seen him angry before, but never like this. His face was twisted in a way that terrified her, rage and frustration boiling over like a storm. And before she even had time to react, he grabbed her by the arm and shoved her back against the wall. Pain shot through her body as her head collided with the corner of the wall. She gasped, disoriented, struggling to breathe. The room spun, but Ryan didn't stop. He slammed his fist into the doorframe, his knuckles white with fury. Margaret's body trembled as she tried to steady herself, but the force of the impact had left her breathless. Ryan's voice rang in her ears, distorted and muffled. "You don't appreciate anything I do for you. You're worthless. I give you everything, and this is how you repay me." Margaret barely heard him, her mind reeling. She wanted to scream, to escape, but she couldn't move. The pain from the impact on the wall was so intense it clouded her senses. And then, before she could even process what was happening, Ryan grabbed her by the throat. His hand tightened, the pressure choking off her breath. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't fight back. She clawed at his hand, but her fingers couldn't break the vice-like grip he had on her. In that moment, Margaret thought she was going to die. His eyes were wild, filled with hatred, and his grip felt like it was slowly crushing her from the inside out. Her vision blurred, the room spinning, and her body went numb. She felt the last breath leave her body, but just as everything went black, she heard Ryan's voice, low, almost tender, but laced with something darker. "I'll make you remember who's in charge," he whispered, his words suffocating her. And then everything went dark. When Margaret came to, she was lying on the cold tile floor of their bathroom, the sound of running water filling the air. She could feel the sharp pain in her head, and the dizziness made it hard for her to focus. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open, and she realized she was no longer in their bedroom, but somewhere else. A dull, aching pressure in her chest reminded her of the suffocating grip Ryan had placed on her throat. "Margaret?" Ryan's voice was soft, almost too soft. She could hear the fake concern dripping from his words. "Margaret, baby, please wake up." The world swirled around her, but she forced herself to focus on his voice. As she slowly sat up, she realized that she was being supported by Ryan, who was kneeling beside her, his hands gripping her arms as if he was trying to hold her together. "I'm so sorry," he repeated, almost like a mantra. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. I was just so angry. Please don't be mad at me. I love you." Margaret's vision was blurry, but she could see his face, his eyes, filled with a strange mixture of worry and something more sinister. The guilt was there, but it was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by his desire to control the situation. Margaret could feel it, the weight of his words, the guilt he tried to lay on her shoulders, and it terrified her. He was playing the part of the concerned husband, the loving man who just lost control. But she knew this wasn't love. Ryan gently helped her to her feet, and she felt the familiar sting of pain in her head, the deep ache in her neck. He was careful, making sure she didn't fall, but his grip was still too tight, still too controlling. He helped her into their bedroom, where she could barely stand. Her legs felt weak, her body drained from the ordeal. He kissed her forehead as if nothing had happened. "We need to go to the hospital," he said softly. "You passed out. You're not okay. I'm going to take care of you. I'll fix this." Margaret didn't argue. She couldn't. Her mind was too foggy, her body too weak. She let him guide her into the car, his hand never leaving hers. He was careful with her, his voice filled with fake concern, telling her everything was going to be fine. He told her that it was a fall, that she had just slipped. That's the story they were going with, the one that would protect him. At the hospital, Margaret sat in a sterile room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She barely registered the nurses moving around her, her body numb, her mind drifting. Ryan sat beside her, his hand on her shoulder, whispering in her ear, making sure she knew the story. "You fell down the stairs," he repeated, over and over, as if his words would make it true. When the doctor came in, Ryan launched into his rehearsed tale. "She fell down the stairs," he explained, his voice smooth, casual, like he was just a concerned husband. "I came home, and she was at the bottom. I rushed her here as soon as I could." Margaret sat there, her head spinning, trapped between the truth and his lie. The doctor was asking her questions, but the words wouldn't come. She was too scared to speak, too terrified of what would happen if she told them what really happened. Ryan was right there, watching her, controlling everything. The doctor's eyes shifted from Ryan to Margaret, a glimmer of suspicion in his gaze. But Ryan was quick to fill the silence, smiling, reassuring the staff. "She's always been clumsy," he said with a laugh, trying to make light of the situation. "Always bumping into things." But Margaret couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her chest. She wanted to speak, to tell them everything, but the fear of what Ryan would do if she did paralyzed her. She was trapped. And in that moment, the hope she had once clung to, that things would get better, that this wasn't really happening, began to slip away. The hours at the hospital dragged on like an eternity. Margaret sat in the sterile examination room, her body numb, her mind a swirl of confusion and fear. Ryan was still by her side, playing the role of the loving, concerned husband, whispering reassurances in her ear, repeating the same story about the fall. The doctors and nurses came in and out, but Margaret barely noticed them. Her head ached, and the physical pain from the beating still lingered, but it was the emotional weight of what had happened that pressed down hardest on her. Ryan had done it again. He had convinced everyone, convinced her that this was just another accident. He had fabricated a story, and she was too terrified to speak the truth. Every time she tried to find her voice, the fear of what would happen to her if she did kept her silent. What if they didn't believe her? What if they sided with him? What if he hurt her even worse when they got home? The thoughts raced through her mind like a storm she couldn't escape. The doctor came in for a quick checkup, running through the usual questions and tests. His demeanor was professional, but something about the way he looked at her, his gaze lingering just a little longer than necessary, made Margaret uneasy. She tried to meet his eyes, but quickly looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of the hospital gown. Ryan stood nearby, his presence looming over her like a shadow, and Margaret felt his eyes on her too, watching her every move. The doctor finished his examination and nodded, turning to Ryan. "We'll need to take a few more tests, just to be sure there's no internal damage from the fall. But otherwise, it looks like she'll be fine with some rest." Ryan nodded, smiling, and as soon as the doctor stepped out, he was back at Margaret's side, his hand gently resting on her arm. "See, everything's going to be fine. You're going to be okay." Margaret nodded, but inside she felt numb. She couldn't keep pretending anymore. She couldn't go back to the way things were, couldn't keep lying to herself. But the fear held her hostage. What would happen if she told them the truth? What would Ryan do to her? Would anyone believe her over him? But then, as if the universe had decided it was time for a shift, something unexpected happened. The nurse, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a soft smile, came in to check Margaret's vitals. She was efficient, calm, but there was something about her that made Margaret feel seen. The nurse moved around the room, checking the machines and writing on the clipboard, but there was no rush in her movements, no urgency to get in and out as quickly as possible. After a few minutes, the nurse glanced up at Margaret, her expression softening. "How are you doing, hon?" she asked quietly, her voice gentle, almost as though she knew Margaret was holding something back. Margaret stiffened, but the nurse didn't seem to notice. She simply kept her gaze on Margaret, waiting for an answer. The room felt heavy with unspoken words, and for a brief moment, Margaret felt the weight of her own silence. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell this woman, this stranger, the truth. But the fear came flooding back, paralyzing her. "I'm fine," Margaret mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to smile, but it felt hollow, fake. The nurse didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, but there was a look in her eyes that made Margaret pause. The nurse put down her clipboard and took a step closer, leaning in slightly, lowering her voice so that Ryan wouldn't hear. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her tone full of warmth and something else, something that felt like understanding. "You don't have to be afraid to talk. We're here to help you, okay? You don't have to go through this alone. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. For a second, she froze. She wanted to cry, to spill everything out, but her throat tightened and the words wouldn't come. She could hear Ryan's footsteps outside the room, his voice muffled, but it was as though the nurse's words had created a small space in the suffocating silence. I know it's hard, the nurse continued, her voice low and steady, but if you're in danger, we can help you. You don't have to live like this. You're not alone. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, afraid of what might happen if Ryan saw them. She wasn't sure what she expected from this nurse, maybe just a few comforting words, something to reassure her that there was a way out. But this was more than she had ever hoped for. This woman was offering her something that no one else had, a chance, however small, to escape. The nurse gave her a small, knowing smile before turning to leave. I'll be right outside if you need anything, she said, her voice soft but resolute. You can always talk to me, okay? Margaret watched as the nurse walked out, her heart racing. For the first time in so long, she felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just the nurse being polite. This was someone who saw her, someone who cared. Ryan came back into the room, his face still plastered with concern, but Margaret could barely focus on him now. She was still processing what the nurse had said. She had always been so afraid of what would happen if she told someone, but now, for the first time, Margaret saw a small opening in her prison. She wasn't alone. There were people out there who could help her, who would believe her. She wasn't sure what she was going to do next. She wasn't sure if she was ready to speak the truth. Not yet. But that small, quiet encouragement from the nurse, the belief that she could break free, was enough to give her the courage to take the first step. And for the first time, Margaret allowed herself to hope. The following morning, the hospital room felt like a cage. Margaret had barely slept, her body aching from the violence, her mind racing with the weight of what had happened. She hadn't spoken to Ryan much since the nurse had left. His earlier concerns seemed fake now, like they were just a mask for his real intentions. He had played the perfect husband, comforting her with his sweet words, but Margaret could feel the tension in his touch, the nervousness in his eyes as he stood at her bedside, waiting for her to say something, anything. Ryan hadn't noticed how she'd flinched when the nurse had spoken to her, or the way Margaret had withdrawn from him. His attention was always on controlling the narrative, on keeping up appearances, making sure everyone believed his version of the story. He continued to smile, to pretend like nothing was wrong, but the undercurrent of fear in the room was palpable. Margaret couldn't ignore the sense of foreboding that clung to her. Her body felt weak, but there was something else now, something sharp. She couldn't lie to herself any longer. She couldn't keep pretending everything was okay when her body told a different story. She had been living in a lie for too long. The doctor arrived later that morning, his expression serious as he approached her bedside. Ryan, ever the concerned husband, immediately stood up, his usual charm and composure in full display. Margaret's stomach twisted with anxiety. This moment, the truth, was coming, and she wasn't sure if she was ready. The doctor, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a calm demeanor, addressed both of them. I've reviewed your scans, Margaret, he said, looking at her, then turning to Ryan with a brief, almost imperceptible glance. The results show a concerning pattern of trauma. It appears that several of your injuries are not consistent with a single fall, but with repeated physical trauma over time. Some of the bruising on your arms, your ribs, and your neck are in different stages of healing. These injuries weren't caused by a fall, Mrs. Mitchell. They're consistent with physical abuse. Margaret's breath caught in her chest. It was as if the world stopped turning for a moment. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore, and yet she still couldn't believe they were being spoken aloud. Ryan froze beside her, his face draining of color. For a brief second, Margaret saw it, the raw, exposed panic in his eyes. His facade was cracking. He was trying to regain control, but the damage had been done. The doctor's words had planted a seed of doubt, and Margaret could feel the shift in the room. The truth, no longer just a whisper in her mind, was now undeniable. "Doctor, you're wrong," Ryan said quickly, his voice shaking, his attempt at calmness faltering. "She's clumsy. She bruises easily. It's just the way she is. She's always tripping and falling. I'm sure that's all this is. She's just had a few accidents." But the doctor wasn't fooled. He didn't back down. "I've been a physician for over 20 years, Mr. Mitchell. I've seen many cases of domestic abuse, and this is not consistent with a simple fall. You're going to need to answer for this." His tone was firm, no longer leaving room for doubt. Ryan's face twisted with rage. Margaret could see it now. His charming demeanor had vanished, and in its place was the monster she had seen flashes of before. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. The anger he had once kept hidden behind closed doors was now surfacing, and it was terrifying. "You don't know what you're talking about," Ryan hissed, his voice low and dangerous. He took a step closer to the doctor, and Margaret felt her pulse quicken in fear. "This is none of your business. You don't know her. She's crazy. She doesn't know what she's saying." The doctor stood his ground. "If you don't leave, I'll be forced to contact security," he said, his voice steady. "This is a hospital, not a place for threats or intimidation." Ryan's eyes burned with fury, but he took a step back, clearly weighing his options. His attempts to control the narrative were slipping away, and he knew it. He turned his gaze back to Margaret, his expression shifting from rage to something colder, more calculating. "You're not going to get away with this," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "You won't win. You never will." Margaret recoiled, fear coursing through her veins. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him she was done, that she had finally had enough. But the words were stuck in her throat. She was paralyzed, trapped in the same cycle of terror and self-doubt that had kept her silent for so long. As Ryan stormed out of the room, the doctor turned to Margaret, his eyes soft with empathy. "We're going to take care of you, okay? We've already contacted the authorities. They'll be here soon." The mention of the police filled her with dread, but something in her shifted. She wasn't alone anymore. The weight of her silence, of living in fear, seemed to lift just slightly. The hospital staff, the doctor, the nurse, they were on her side. They saw the truth, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt like she could breathe. The authorities arrived shortly after, and the police officer, a woman in her early 40s, with short brown hair and a no-nonsense attitude, introduced herself. "We need to ask you a few questions, Mrs. Mitchell. Is it all right if we speak with you alone?" Margaret nodded, feeling a small flicker of hope in her chest. The decision to speak was still daunting, but as she sat there looking at the woman who was not afraid to ask the difficult questions, she realized that this was her chance. This was the moment she could finally break free from the silence that had bound her for so long. The officer's questions were straightforward but kind. She didn't rush, didn't pressure Margaret. She just listened. And when Margaret spoke, when she finally told her story, the weight of it seemed to evaporate, if only for a moment. It wasn't much, just a few words, but it was the first step toward reclaiming her life. As the police officer made notes, a feeling of clarity washed over Margaret. She wasn't trapped anymore. She had people on her side. There was a way out. With the support of the doctor, the nurse, the police, and her family, Margaret knew that she was no longer alone in this fight. And for the first time in years, she believed that she could win. The days leading up to the trial were a blur of emotions: fear, anxiety, but also something else. A small, almost imperceptible shift in Margaret's heart. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something she thought she had lost forever: her own voice. The weight of the past, the years of silence and submission, was heavy on her shoulders, but now it felt different. She was no longer hiding in the shadows. She was preparing to step into the light, to confront the man who had torn her down for so long. The courtroom was cold, sterile, the air thick with the weight of expectation. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she sat in the witness stand, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, jurors, lawyers, and strangers. For a moment, it felt like she was drowning in the sea of anxiety that had gripped her ever since the decision to testify had been made. Her hands trembled in her lap, and her thoughts raced. She had never imagined she'd be here in this place, standing up against Ryan, the man she had once loved, the man who had broken her. She had been afraid of this moment for so long. But now, as she sat there, she realized something. She was ready. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Hayes, was kind but firm. She had prepared Margaret for this day, helping her gather the strength to speak the truth. "You don't have to do this alone," Sarah had told her more than once. "We'll be with you every step of the way." But as the trial began, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of fear that gripped her heart when the defense attorney began to speak. He was smooth, his words calculated and cold. He began by questioning the truth of Margaret's testimony, trying to discredit her, asking her why she hadn't left earlier, why she hadn't reported the abuse sooner. His questions were designed to make her doubt herself, to cast shadows of doubt on her every word. Margaret felt the weight of his words pressing on her. But this time, something was different. She had prepared herself for this moment. She wasn't going to let him turn her into the victim again. She wasn't going to let him make her feel weak. Every word that came from his mouth, she met with the strength she had been building over the past months. She knew that what she was saying, what she had endured, was the truth. The hardest part came when Ryan was called to the stand. He was as calm and collected as ever, his demeanor still smooth, still that same charming facade he had worn when they first met. He sat across from Margaret, his eyes locking with hers, and for a moment she could feel the same fear and dread that had consumed her for so long. But this time it was different. This time she wasn't afraid of him. Ryan's testimony was a careful performance. He painted himself as the concerned husband, the man who had only ever wanted to protect his wife. He played the role of the victim, trying to turn the tables on her, to make it seem as though it was Margaret who was at fault. He claimed that she was unstable, that she had exaggerated the events. His lies were so rehearsed, so well practiced, that for a moment Margaret wondered if anyone would believe her over him. But as he spoke, something inside her clicked. She remembered all the years she had spent justifying his actions, making excuses for him. She remembered the slaps, the insults, the nights spent hiding her bruises. She remembered the tears and the pain and the isolation. And now, as she looked at him across the courtroom, she saw him for what he truly was, a man who had broken her but had never been able to break her spirit. The truth was on her side. Her turn to speak came, and when Sarah Hayes called her name, Margaret stood with a strength she didn't know she had. She faced the jury, the judge, and most importantly, she faced herself. The words came slowly at first, but as she spoke, they grew stronger, more confident. She spoke about the first time he hit her, the isolation, the fear. She told them about the promises he had made, the lies he had told, the way he had manipulated and controlled her. She didn't hold back. She didn't shy away. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the power of her own voice. She looked at Ryan as she spoke, his eyes cold and calculating. But there was something else there now, something that wasn't there before. It was fear. For the first time in their relationship, Ryan was afraid. He was no longer the man who controlled everything. He was the man who was about to lose everything. Margaret finished her testimony, and the weight that had been crushing her for so long began to lift. She had said the truth, and there was no going back. The jury had heard her, the judge had heard her, and most importantly, she had heard herself. She had reclaimed her power, and there was no force on earth that could take it away from her now. After hours of deliberation, the verdict finally came. The jury had found Ryan guilty. The weight of it hit Margaret like a tidal wave, but this time it wasn't a crushing blow. It was a release. The man who had made her feel small, insignificant, had been exposed for what he was. He was going to face the consequences of his actions, and she would no longer have to live in fear of him. When the judge read the verdict, Margaret felt something she had never thought possible, a sense of justice. She had been afraid of this moment, afraid of facing Ryan and the truth. But now, as she sat there, she realized that it wasn't the fear that had defined her. It was her courage, her strength, her ability to stand up when everything around her was falling apart. For the first time in years, Margaret felt empowered. As Ryan was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Margaret didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel hatred. She simply felt free. The burden of his control, his lies, had been lifted. She had taken a stand, and she had won. For the first time in a long time, she knew that the road ahead would be hard, but it would also be hers to walk. And as she stepped out of the courtroom, surrounded by her family and friends, Margaret knew that this was just the beginning of her healing. She had faced her abuser, and she had won. Now it was time to rebuild. The weeks following the trial were a blur for Margaret. The verdict had been a watershed moment in her life, but she quickly learned that the battle wasn't over. The physical bruises had faded, but the emotional scars lingered, etched into her memory like ink on paper. The weight of the years she had spent in silence and fear still pressed on her, and though she had found the courage to speak out, she knew the path to healing would be long. But for the first time, Margaret was ready to face it. The first step was therapy. She had been hesitant at first, unsure of what to expect or if it would help. The idea of reliving the pain, of digging through the rubble of her past, was terrifying. But the gentle encouragement of her therapist, Dr. Chun, made all the difference. Dr. Chun was warm, patient, and non-judgmental. She didn't rush Margaret, didn't force her to open up before she was ready. Each session felt like a small step forward, a piece of the puzzle falling into place. "Your pain is real," Dr. Chun had told her during one of their first meetings. "But it doesn't define you. It's part of your story, but it's not the whole story." Those words became Margaret's mantra. Slowly, she began to see that her life wasn't solely shaped by the abuse. There was so much more to her than the victim she had been made to feel she was. She was a woman who had survived, who had the strength to keep going even when everything around her seemed impossible. With each session, she began to reclaim pieces of herself that had been lost for so long. But healing wasn't just about therapy. Margaret also had to rebuild the aspects of her life that had been taken from her during those years. The first thing she did was find a new job. After years of being controlled, having every decision made for her, Margaret was determined to regain her independence. She found a position as a bookkeeper at a small, family-owned business. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. It was something she could control. The first day she walked into that office, her heart raced with excitement and nerves, but as the day went on, she realized she could do this. She could take care of herself. The satisfaction of earning her own paycheck, of knowing she was standing on her own 2 feet, gave her a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the money, it was the freedom that came with it. Margaret could make decisions for herself now. She could do things on her own without someone controlling her every move. It was a small victory, but to her, it felt like a triumph. As her confidence grew, so did her desire to reconnect with the people who had always been there for her friends, her family. It wasn't easy. The isolation Ryan had forced on her had left deep wounds in her relationships. Her friends had pulled away, hurt by her absence, confused by her silence. And her family, though supportive, had felt like distant strangers during her marriage. But Margaret knew she had to rebuild these connections if she was ever going to feel whole again. She reached out to her mother first. The conversation wasn't easy. There was guilt, there was sorrow, and there were tears. "I should have known," her mother had said, her voice thick with regret. "I should have seen what was happening. I should have been there for you." Margaret had reassured her mother, telling her that she wasn't to blame. Ryan had been good at hiding the truth. But more than anything, Margaret realized that she had to forgive herself. She couldn't carry the weight of guilt that wasn't hers to bear. Slowly, her relationship with her mother healed, and with it, her connection to the rest of her family. Her friends, too, began to return. It wasn't instant and it wasn't perfect, but with time they understood. They had missed her. They had believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. The deeper Margaret dove into rebuilding her life, the more she began to redefine herself. She realized that she didn't have to be the woman she had once been. She didn't have to be the quiet, submissive wife who had let herself be broken by abuse. She was someone new, someone stronger. Margaret discovered her passion for helping others, specifically other women who had been in situations like hers. She started volunteering at a local shelter for domestic violence survivors, offering support and guidance to those who were just beginning their own journeys of healing. Speaking to women who were in the same place she had been, lost, scared, but still holding on, gave Margaret a sense of purpose she had never known before. She became a voice for those who felt they had no voice. She shared her story openly, without shame, without fear. She knew now that her pain was not a sign of weakness. It was a testament to her strength. Through her work at the shelter, Margaret met other survivors who had found the strength to leave their abusers, to rebuild their lives. She heard their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs, and in doing so, she realized that healing wasn't linear. There were good days and bad days, moments of empowerment and moments of doubt. But that didn't make the journey any less valuable. It made it real. It made it hers. In time, Margaret began to see a future that wasn't clouded by fear or pain. She embraced the possibility of a life without the shadow of abuse hanging over her. She started dating again, slowly and carefully, learning to trust herself and others once more. She wasn't in any rush to fill the emptiness that had once been her marriage. Instead, she focused on filling the space with her own joy, her own growth. She had learned that she didn't need a man to define her. She didn't need anyone to complete her. One afternoon, as Margaret sat in her small apartment, a book in hand and a cup of tea by her side, she allowed herself to reflect. The journey had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. She had learned that she was resilient, that her past didn't have to dictate her future. Margaret had rebuilt her life piece by piece, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, she was no longer afraid. She was ready for whatever came next. No longer defined by the abuse she had endured, she was now defined by the strength, the courage, and the hope she had found in the darkest of times. The future was hers to create, and with each passing day, she was making it her own. As Margaret sat in the quiet of her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened, the weight of her journey felt both heavy and light at the same time. The past few years had been some of the darkest of her life, filled with pain, fear, and moments when she felt completely lost. But today, as she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw someone entirely different, a woman who had survived, a woman who had taken her life back, a woman who had found her voice. Margaret thought about everything she had been through, the bruises, the isolation, the countless nights spent wondering if she would make it out alive. She thought about the lies, the manipulation, and the fear that had kept her silent for so long. But she also thought about the breakthrough moments, the moments when she finally allowed herself to be seen, to be heard. The nurse's gentle whisper, the doctor's support, and ultimately, the decision to speak out in the courtroom. All of it had been part of her healing. Surviving was one thing. Healing was something entirely different. But through therapy, through the support of others, and through finding her own strength, Margaret had discovered that healing was possible. It wasn't easy and it didn't happen overnight, but it was happening. Slowly, piece by piece, she had rebuilt her life. She had reclaimed the parts of herself that Ryan had tried so hard to destroy. And now, as she stood tall, a survivor, not just of the abuse, but of the silence that had surrounded it, she knew that her story wasn't just her own. It was for everyone who had suffered in silence, who had felt trapped, who had believed they were unworthy of love or respect. The lesson Margaret had learned, and the lesson she wanted to share with anyone who might be watching this, was simple but powerful. No one deserves to be abused. No one deserves to live in fear. No matter how much someone tries to break you, no matter how convincing the lies may be, you are worthy of love, kindness, and respect. You are deserving of a life free from fear, and you are deserving of a voice. Throughout her journey, Margaret had been surrounded by people who believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. But she knew that not everyone had the same support. Many people, especially women, were still suffering in silence, afraid to speak up, afraid to ask for help. That's why she wanted to share her story, to give others the courage to do what she had done. Speak out, seek help, and start the journey toward healing. Margaret's story was not just one of survival, but of empowerment. It was about reclaiming your power, your dignity, and your life. She wanted others to know that they didn't have to suffer in silence, that there were resources available, that there were people who would help them just as she had been helped. If you are watching this and you are in an abusive situation, know this: you are not alone. There are people out there who care. There are shelters, hotlines, and advocates ready to listen and offer support. You don't have to face this by yourself. Reach out, talk to someone, and take the first step toward freedom. If you know someone who might be suffering, be the person who sees them. Be the person who listens. Don't turn away. Don't ignore the signs. Your belief in them could be the difference between them staying in silence and finding the courage to escape. Please share this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you are in need of help, reach out. You are not weak for seeking support. You are brave for taking the first step. There is always help available. There is always a way out. No matter how trapped you feel, no matter how hopeless things seem, you can break free. You are not alone. You are strong. You deserve love and respect, not fear and pain. Your journey may be long, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. You have the power to reclaim your life. And with every step you take, remember, you are worthy of everything good this world has to offer.